The Scottish collaboration is taking place from Monday the 5th to Sunday the 11th of December. So why not join us, and you might just find your next big obsession. Full details can be found at scottishmurders.com/collab.
Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
This will be Scottish Murders' last normal episode this year. However, as part of the Scottish collaboration, we will be releasing slightly different episodes from Monday the 5th to Sunday the 11th of December, and we hope you give those a listen too. We will be back with our normal episodes in January 2023. Today's story was requested by Kirstin, one of our listeners. We hope you enjoy the episode, Kirstin, and thank you so much for the pronunciations of certain words I wasn't sure about. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that this story is a simple case of murder. 2 men went up Goatfell Mountain, but only one came down. However, this case is anything but straightforward, and it's still debated today whether it was indeed a murder or whether it was just an accident. So, as you listen to the story unfold, what do you think happened? Let me know either on social media or by emailing me at contact@scottishmurders.com. And early in 2023, I will do a special episode where I will feature all of the points of view I receive from you, the listener. Before I begin, a lot of the information I got for this story was from the book The Goatfell Murder by Callum Smith. Goatfell Mountain is located on the Isle of Arran, which is an island on the west coast of Scotland and is a 2.5-hour drive and ferry trip southwest of Glasgow. The Isle of Bute lies just north of the Isle of Arran and is a 1-hour and 49-minute drive and ferry trip west of Glasgow. Just to give you an idea of the size of the 2 islands, the Isle of Arran, according to the Goatfell Murder book, is 19 miles long and 10 miles wide, which is about 30.5 kilometres long by 16.9 kilometres wide. And the Isle of Bute, according to scottishoutlander.co.uk, is around 15 miles long and 4 miles wide, which is about 24 kilometres long by 6.4 kilometres wide. The Isle of Bute has always been a popular holiday destination for Glaswegians, and back in 1889, steamboats would carry passengers to the Isle of Bute and the Isle of Arran. Many who were on holiday on the Isle of Bute would take day steamboat trips to visit the Isle of Arran, and this is how 28-year-old John Watson Laurie and 32-year-old Edwin Robert Rose came to meet. John Watson Laurie was born in 1861, although he told most people he met that he was born in 1864, and he was brought up in Coatbridge, which is a 21-minute drive east of Glasgow, with his dad James, his 3 brothers Gavin, James and Matthew, and his sister Agnes. Sadly, John's mum, also called Agnes, had died when he was still a young boy. The Laurie family were very religious and well respected, and John's dad had his own business as a grain dealer. John was a bit of a troubled lad, with it being reported that he caused his dad a bit of grief, playing truant from school and running away, and one time apparently been found on an ocean liner. According to the Goatfell Murder book, there apparently also was insanity in his family, and that John himself had shown signs of mental abnormality. When John was 15 years old, his dad remarried, and the couple quickly had a son who they called David. John did not get along with his stepmother, Jeanie, and there were many fallings out. He also refused to accept his stepbrother, David. As an adult, John was described to be about 5 foot 6 inches tall, or 1.7 metres, with either fair or brown hair, and with blue or grey eyes, and having a slight moustache and sideburns. Following his wild childhood and regularly running away, he appeared to settle down, despite the regular fallings out at home with his stepmother, and eventually John trained and served an apprenticeship as a pattern maker, which is like a mould maker, and this was a relatively well-paid, very skilled profession. However, in his early 20s, following another falling out with his stepmother, he was asked to leave the family home. John then moved to Glasgow where, according to the Goatfell murder book, he led a somewhat rudderless existence. He would constantly be changing jobs and accommodation and was unable to settle with one job or one place. He also liked to live beyond his means and began to get into debt. And things don't get any better in John's life when in 1887, when he was 26 years old, he met and began a relationship with 16-year-old Annie McLean. Annie was still at school, and her father was not happy about the age gap between his daughter and John, or the fact that she should be concentrating on her studies and not on a relationship, as she wanted to become a teacher. Annie's father, Peter, finally spoke to John and said this to him, and he warned him to stay away from his daughter. However, John ignored this, and the relationship continued. However, around June 1888, when Peter confronted his daughter Annie and told her the same thing, that she should stay away from John, she actually complied, which annoyed John, provoking him to apparently send some pretty insulting letters to the McLean family. And when John found out shortly afterwards that Annie had taken up with a teacher, he was enraged and filled with jealousy. And according to the Goatfell book, upon John finding this out, he had been perfectly careless about what I did, and my one thought was how to punish her enough for the cruel wrong she had done me. Something that might have also fueled the rage John felt towards Annie was that shortly after she had ended their relationship, he had been fired from his job, so he was on the hunt yet again for another one. Also in June 1888, possibly to continue to fund the lavish lifestyle that John had become accustomed to, despite his sporadic income not being able to keep up with it, John stole £18 worth of jewellery from his landlady, which in today's money would be about £1,800 or about $2,000, leaving him again to find alternative accommodation. It was also possible that he had stolen this money to enable him to take his regular annual holiday to Rothsay on the Isle of Bute, as apparently he went there a few weeks later. And it just so happened that his ex-girlfriend, Annie McLean, and her new boyfriend were also holidaying in Rothsay at the same time, and John would be there to spy on them both. When John's holiday on the Isle of Bute came to an end, it was reported that he apparently left his accommodation without paying, something which would become very common for John Laurie. In early January 1889, John had entered into a new relationship with a woman he knew from his church called Grace, who he had known for 3 years before dating. The pair would see each other a couple of times a week, and by late March, early April, John had asked Grace to marry him. Grace had, however, declined, as her father did not approve of John. Not to be deterred, though, John would go on to ask Grace to marry him a further 3 times, but each time Grace declined. Also in March 1889, John was arrested for the theft of the jewellery from his previous landlady, and he appeared in court 2 days later. At this time, despite his father having asked John to leave the family home, he still came to his son's aid, and the charges were dropped when John's father offered to pay the jewellery owner the cost of her jewellery, which was accepted. By this time, John had found himself another job and new accommodation, but he wasn't quite ready to settle down in life yet, as by June 1889, John was yet again in a different job, now working in Springburn, which is a 12-minute journey north-east of Glasgow, and in new accommodation at North Frederick Street, a 9-minute journey north-east of Glasgow city centre. But the landlady didn't see much of John, as he left for work very early in the morning and was often not back until 10 p.m. at night. With John working such long hours in his new job, by early July he was looking forward to the annual trades holiday, which was always between the 6th and the 19th of July, and as usual he would be heading to the Isle of Bute, and had even agreed that he would meet up with his girlfriend Grace at some point on holiday too, as she too would be on holiday in Rothsay, and despite Grace turning down his marriage proposal, the pair continued to be fond of one another and would still meet up regularly. However, a week before John was due to depart for his holiday in Rothsay, he happened to bump into his ex-girlfriend Annie. While Annie had spotted John first and had begun to run away to avoid him seeing her, he did see her, and according to witnesses, he gave chase, caught her, grabbed her by the arm, and began to make some remarks. What these remarks were, I'm not sure, but he clearly still had issues with being dumped by Annie. It also turned out that Annie and her mother would also be going to Rothsay for their annual holiday at the same time as John, and apparently John knew this, as he had said, according to the Goatfell book, that one of the reasons he was going on holiday to Rothsay in 1889 and why he had gone to Rothsay the previous year was to watch her audacious behaviour. Also going to the Isle of Bute for his annual holiday in 1889 was 32-year-old Edwin Robert Rose. Edwin was described as being about 5 foot 7 inches or 1.73 metres tall, with dark hair, sideburns and a moustache. He was the middle child of 7 brothers and sisters and lived in Upper Tooting in London with his family. According to the Goatfell murder book, Edwin worked as a clerk for a retired builder, not a very well-paid profession. The Rose family were not wealthy, with Edwin's father receiving a meagre pension. And at the time of Edwin's annual holiday in July 1889, it was reported that the Rose family had fallen on even harder times. Edwin also played and taught the violin and was a Sunday school teacher. He also was involved in a movement called the Temperance, which according to Wikipedia is a social movement promoting temperance or complete abstinence from consumption of alcoholic beverage. Participants in the movement typically criticise alcohol intoxication or promote teetotalism, and its leaders emphasise alcohol's negative effects on people's health, personalities, and family lives. Typically, the movement promotes alcohol education, and it also demands the passage of new laws against the sale of alcohol, either regulations on the availability of alcohol or the complete prohibition of it. However, apparently, while on holiday, Edwin was known to have a brandy flask in his possession, for medicinal purposes, of course. So, at the beginning of July 1889, both John Laurie and Edwin Rose would make their way to their holiday destination of the Isle of Bute. On the 4th of July 1889, Edwin began his journey from London to Scotland, and ultimately Rothsay on the Isle of Bute. Now, despite Edwin not being a big earner and his family not really being well off, he had booked himself into the upmarket Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel, which overlooked Rothsay Bay. One of the reasons Edwin had chosen to stay at this particularly prestigious hotel was because it had tennis courts, and Edwin was a particularly keen tennis player, actually bringing with him from London his tennis gear and racket. The other reason may have been because the owner of the hotel was also a supporter of the temperance movement, and thus there was no drinking alcohol in his hotel. So by staying in such a hotel for this holiday, which was definitely not a lifestyle he would regularly enjoy, perhaps he was trying to appear to be more affluent than he actually was. On the 6th of July, John Laurie left Glasgow for his annual holiday, but instead of staying in Rothsay, which was popular with those looking for a more lively holiday, as well as where Edwin would be staying, he went to the quieter Port Bannatyne on the Isle of Bute and checked into a guest house called Iona Place, which was ran by a Mrs. Curry, where he paid to stay for 2 weeks. However, he checked in under the name of John Annandale, and he even produced a calling card or business card that also said John Annandale. Apparently, throughout this holiday, John Laurie introduced himself to everyone as John Annandale, even to those who knew him as John Laurie. Now, from what I have read, the fact he was using an alias wasn't a big thing back then. When you went on holiday, you could be whoever you wanted, and so John Laurie wanted to be John Annandale, and he pretended he was somebody he wasn't. It also, of course, helped if John undertook a different name during this holiday, as he had the awful habit of leaving his accommodation without paying. On the morning of Friday, the 12th of July, a few days into his holiday on the Isle of Bute, John decided to go on a steamboat day trip to the Isle of Arran. It was on this steamboat trip that John Laurie met Edwin Rose for the first time, although Edwin Rose had also been staying on the Isle of Bute, and the pair had seen each other at some point during their holiday before this chance meeting. It was actually Edwin who approached John Laurie, or Annandale, to say hello, thinking that he recognised him as also staying at the Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel. And despite this not being the case, the pair had a wee chat and realised that they had a few things in common, such as they were both religious and both attended Sunday school. And John likely would have been impressed that Edwin was staying at the prestigious Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel, possibly even wrongly assuming that Edwin was wealthier than he actually was. Edwin Rose had been accompanied on the steamboat trip by 2 other men who he had met at the Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel in Rothsay on the Isle of Bute. They were Francis Meikle and William Thom. And John Laurie too was with someone he had met on the Isle of Bute at his accommodation by the name of James Aitken. While John and Edwin chatted, the steamboat got closer to the Isle of Arran, at which point the pair would have seen Goatfell Mountain, which is the highest point on the Isle of Arran, standing at 874 metres or 2,867 feet. It is not known exactly what was said between the 2 men on the steamboat. One possibility is that Edwin mentioned to John that he would like to climb Goatfell Mountain, and John perhaps agreed to accompany him, as the Goatfell Murder book mentions that John at one point said that his reason for going to Arran was to climb Goatfell Mountain. Another possibility, though, as put forward by John Laurie, was that Edwin had forced himself on John Laurie. He had insisted that he would accompany John up Goatfell Mountain, and that John was not particularly happy about this. However it transpired, it appeared that John and Edwin would climb Goatfell Mountain together. The steamboat then arrived on the Isle of Arran, and the group, now being John Laurie, or Annandale, Edwin Rose, Francis Meikle and William Thom, as John's friend James Aitken had met others he knew and had gone with them, departed the boat and spent a short amount of time on the Isle of Arran, as it was only a day trip. But it was agreed that the group would come back to the Isle of Arran the following day to spend more time, and also for John and Edwin to climb Goatfell Mountain. Before the group left the Isle of Arran again, John had managed to secure accommodation in the form of a sparsely furnished outhouse in Brodick, which is the main village on the Isle of Arran, with a Mrs. Walker, for himself and Edwin for a week, for when they returned to the island. The 4 men then headed back to the Isle of Bute on the steamboat. However, instead of John going back to his accommodation, he instead spent the night in the upmarket Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel with Edwin, William and Francis. So the next day, on Saturday the 13th of July, the 4 friends, John, Edwin, Francis and William, took the steamboat back to the Isle of Arran and head to the accommodation in Brodick that John had booked the day before for himself and Edwin. The 4 then go for tea at the accommodation of a friend of Francis and William's, 24-year-old Andrew Gilmore, who was a medical student and on holiday in Corrie, which was about a 5-mile trip north of John and Edwin's accommodation in Brodick. After having tea at Andrew Gilmore's holiday home, John and Edwin head back to Brodick, and Francis and William find accommodation with friends on a yacht before the group met up again on the Sunday. However, by this time, Francis Meikle had taken a dislike to John Laurie, saying later that he was very uncommunicative, wouldn't answer any questions about where he came from or what his job was, and that he kept disappearing and reappearing, which all caused Francis Meikle to greatly mistrust John Laurie, so much so he had apparently advised Edwin to think twice about climbing Goatfell Mountain with him. One reason for John being uncommunicative could have been because he was suffering from toothache at the time, and Edwin had actually allowed him to have some of his medicinal brandy, but he had been most put out when John Laurie had drank it all. And the disappearing and reappearing could have been because, like John said, the company of Edwin had been forced upon him, and he was maybe taking some time out for himself. Although if he truly wasn't happy about being in the company of Edwin, Francis and William, then why not just disappear and not come back? On Sunday, John and Edwin spent time walking about the Isle of Arran together, and then on Monday the 15th of July, John and Edwin met up again with William and Francis, and the foursome spent most of the day together before William and Francis left the Isle of Arran on the steamboat about 3:30 p.m. But not before Francis once again warned Edwin that he should not climb Goatfell Mountain with John, as he just didn't trust him. However, Edwin ignored the warnings, and he and John began their climb of Goatfell Mountain. Now, Goatfell Mountain is really popular with climbers and tourists, and so Edwin and John were seen by many as they made their way up the mountain, either overtaking slower climbers or being overtaken by faster ones. But when they were encountered, they both chatted to the other walkers and there appeared to be no problems. John wasn't uncommunicative at all. John and Edwin reached the summit of Goatfell and were seen there by at least 5 witnesses. They told those also at the summit of Goatfell that they planned on taking a different route down Goatfell Mountain to the one they had just come up, despite this being the normal route back down for most who climbed Goatfell. After spending no more than 6 minutes at the summit, John and Edwin left to make their way back down, being seen for the last time leaving the summit at about 6:15 p.m. This was the last time Edwin would be seen alive. 3 days later, on Thursday the 18th of July, Edwin's family became concerned as he had not returned from his holiday as expected. By Monday the 22nd of July, Edwin's family had begun to make inquiries on the Isle of Bute, where Edwin said he would be staying, to see if they could determine his whereabouts. Having found out that Edwin had gone to the Isle of Arran with friends, on Saturday the 27th of July, Edwin's brother Benjamin arrived on the Isle of Arran and headed to Brodick, where Edwin had been staying with John Laurie. Mrs. Walker, the landlady at the accommodation where John had booked himself and Edwin in for the week, told Edwin's brother that on Tuesday the 16th of July she had gone to waken the 2 men at about 11 a.m, only to find the men and their bags gone, with only Edwin's tennis racket and John's straw hat being left behind. She had been annoyed as the bill had not been paid. Upon other inquiries being made, it was found out that John Laurie was seen on Tuesday the 16th of July at 7 a.m. on the ferry leaving the Isle of Arran, alone, with Edwin's Gladstone bag. So where was Edwin? There had not been a confirmed sighting of him since Monday the 15th of July at 6:15 p.m. at the summit of Goatfell. And so, on Sunday the 28th of July, 13 days after the last sighting of Edwin, a full-scale search of Goatfell was organised. However, despite at least 200 people carrying out the search, the climb up Goatfell Mountain was arduous and dangerous, with exposed drops of up to 32 feet or about 10 metres, and some parts of the mountain looked as if they had not been visited before. And so it wasn't until 2:15 p.m. on Sunday the 3rd of August, a week later, as Sundays were the best day for searches to be carried out as everyone was off work, that Edwin's body was finally found under a massive boulder at a height of 1,500 feet or 457 metres near the head of Glen Sannox that had a cavity under it where Edwin's body had been found face down, and a man-made dry wall of 42 stones with the grass and heather in between concealed the entrance. Edwin was briefly examined on the mountain by Dr. Andrew Gilmore, who was on holiday in Corrie at the time, and by Dr. William Fullerton, who lived on the Isle of Arran, and they noted that there were extensive and severe injuries to Edwin's head and face, with his skull being in 8 or 9 pieces and smashed beyond recognition, so much so that Edwin could only be identified by his clothing by his distraught brother. It was also noted that the bottom of the coat that Edwin was wearing was up and around his head. Edwin's pockets were all empty, a walking stick and part of Edwin's waterproof jacket were found nearby in heather. However, high above where Edwin's body was found, at the foot of a 32-foot drop, a knife, a button and a pencil were found, as well as a cap being found at the foot of a 19-foot drop. If these items had fallen out of Edwin's pockets, the question was he pushed or did he fall? Edwin's brother Benjamin believed that his brother had been drugged and then dragged or carried to the boulder and placed under it. And about 9 days after Edwin's body was found, a small glass bottle had been discovered near the boulder where Edwin had been found, and it had apparently smelled of laudanum. Had this bottle belonged to John, or was it completely unrelated? Edwin's body was then placed in a wooden box and carried down the mountain, and a complete examination of Edwin's body took place the following day by Doctors Gilmore and Fullerton. It was discovered that he had a broken shoulder. His upper jaw had been detached, his upper vertebrae was detached, he had broken ribs and a buttock wound, with most of the injuries all being on his left side. His clothing was only damaged around his shoulder and buttock wounds. There was no other damage to his limbs or hands, and there were no signs of extensive bleeding. Although being high up in the mountain, the weather was erratic and it had rained. The post-mortem concluded that the death was caused by repeated blows on the left side of the head, inflicted by a heavy instrument, such as a stone. So, following finding Edwin's body under a large boulder with severe and extensive injuries, the police were keen to speak to the last man he was seen with, John Annandale, who we know as John Laurie. So let me tell you what John had been up to since being seen at the summit of Goatfell at 6:15 p.m. on Monday the 15th of July. A young shepherd called David, who had been with two young women near a graveyard, came forward to the police to say that he had seen who he believed to have been John Laurie come down off the mountain at Corrie between 9 and 9:30 p.m. on Monday the 15th of July, which meant that John had come down from Goatfell Mountain on a particularly difficult and not well-used route. However, when the two women who had been with David were questioned, they denied that this had happened, or that David had disclosed to them seeing a man that night. The next confirmed sighting of John is at the Corrie Hotel just before 10 p.m, where he met a man who was camping nearby with some friends, and had asked the man if he would order a drink for him, which was ordered through a window into the bar on the outside of the hotel. The two men then had a brief chat over their drinks, with the man later telling the police that John was quite composed and not anxious in the slightest. John then walked off in the direction of Brodick, which is 6 miles or 9.6 kilometres from Corrie, where his and Edwin's accommodation and bags were. It would likely have taken John about 2 hours to walk this distance, and it just so happens that a man is seen near Brodick Castle Woods around about midnight, and this was likely John. He is then seen again on Tuesday the 16th of July at 7 a.m. on the ferry from the Isle of Arran, heading to the mainland, by medical student Andrew Gilmore, who John, Edwin, Francis and William had had tea with a few nights previously. Andrew actually helped John onto the ferry with his bags, and the pair then shared a train carriage from Robertson to Glasgow, a 50-minute journey north-east. Once in Glasgow, John pawned Edwin's Gladstone bag and possessions before making his way to his flat at North Frederick Street, where he asked his landlady to wash a chocolate-striped tennis suit for him. This tennis suit belonged to Edwin. Later the same day, John, with his newly washed tennis suit, made his way back to his accommodation at Iona Place in Port Bannatyne on the Isle of Bute, where he again checks in as John Annandale. It is from this point on that witnesses said that John was wearing very different clothing to what he had been wearing when he first arrived on the Isle of Bute, with one distinctive item of clothing being a chocolate-striped tennis suit, which many witnesses on the island knew belonged to Edwin Rose. Other than the oddity that John was now being seen wearing Edwin's distinctive clothing, nothing else appeared out of turn, and John spent the rest of his holiday enjoying all that the Isle of Bute had to offer, which included, according to the Goatfell Murder book, pleasure cruises, excursions, romantic evening sailings, music on the promenade by fiddlers or pipers, concert parties, dancing, many public houses, and even fireworks. It was a great place to meet people and have a good time, with John being known to enjoy flirting with the ladies, and according to reports, that was exactly what he was doing for the remainder of his stay on the Isle of Bute, all while continuing to prance around wearing the distinctive chocolate-striped tennis suit. John also met up with his girlfriend at the time, Grace Chalmers, who also confirmed he had been wearing a tennis suit, something that she had not seen him to have possessed before. Also, the man John Laurie had been with on the steamboat the day he had met Edwin, James Aitken, also reported seeing John around the island and reported to have seen him wearing a white yachting cap, one which he had never seen him wear before, but certainly was very familiar to one he had seen Edwin Rose wearing. The sightings of John having been seen to wear both the tennis suit and white yachting cap on the last week of his holiday go on and on. It was also reported that when John was asked if he had enjoyed his time on the Isle of Arran, and specifically his climb of Goatfell Mountain, he said he had, but that his companion had been very slow, and so it had not been as enjoyable a time as he had hoped. Now, while John left the Isle of Arran on Tuesday the 16th of July with Edwin's bag and possessions and headed to Glasgow to pawn the items before heading back to Port Bannatyne to enjoy the remainder of his holiday and appearing to be flaunting quite openly the fact he was wearing Edwin's clothes, and while Edwin had not been seen since Monday the 15th of July, the first search for Edwin didn't actually take place until Sunday the 28th of July. Edwin's family did become concerned when Edwin did not return home on the day he said he would, but because the telegram office was closed over the weekend, Edwin's family had to wait until it opened again on the Monday morning before being able to message those at the Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel that Edwin had been with. And those who were staying at the Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel and knew Edwin had gone to the Isle of Arran to climb Goatfell Mountain and had not been seen since were not concerned, as they just assumed that Edwin had decided to cut his holiday short and head home, having already paid his bill at the hotel and having taken all of his belongings with him. So it was due to these circumstances and assumptions that had significantly delayed a search for Edwin being carried out, and that allowed John to happily conclude his holiday and parade about wearing Edwin's clothes. So, on Saturday the 20th of July, 8 days before the search for Edwin took place, John left the Isle of Bute, once again not paying his bill, and travelled back to his rented room at North Frederick Street in Glasgow. He then carried on with his daily routines and going to work, albeit it was reported that he was becoming more distressed and anxious at the newspaper reports of the missing man on the Isle of Arran. His anxiety would peak on the 31st of July when he was confronted by someone who knew he had been with Edwin Rose, whose disappearance by this time was widely known, as was the fact the police were looking for the last man to have been seen with Edwin, John Annandale. The man that John Laurie had been with on the steamboat the day he had met Edwin Rose, James Aitken, had apparently not just met Edwin for the first time at their mutual accommodation on the Isle of Bute that year. Apparently, they had met each other the year before while holidaying on the Isle of Bute. It is also suggested, as James Aitken worked for his family who were involved in the grain industry, it is likely that James and John had been aware of each other before meeting on holiday. And so, knowing each other relatively well, John and James had spent the first part of the holiday doing things together, which included taking a steamboat to the Isle of Arran, where they had met Edwin Rose and the two men Edwin had met at his accommodation. So when the news of Edwin's disappearance reached James, he confronted John and asked him what he knew about the disappearance. To which John said he knew nothing, and that Edwin had left the Isle of Arran with John. Although, if that were true, how did the medical student Andrew Gilmore, who knew Edwin, not see him on the boat, but only John? John then said that Edwin had told him he was going to Leeds, which is a city in England. James Aitken, however, didn't believe this story, and told John Laurie that he was going to the police to tell them that John Annandale was John Laurie, which he did. Although it turned out that Francis Meikle, who had stayed with Edwin at the Glenburn Hydropathic Hotel, and who had apparently warned Edwin of going up Goatfell Mountain with John, had already been to the police and told them all about John Laurie being John Annandale. The police had already obtained a photograph of John Annandale and gone to John Laurie's workplace, where it had been confirmed that they were one and the same person. But before the police could get to John Laurie, he left his job, sold all of his tools, and fled the area, again leaving his accommodation at North Frederick Street without paying. Before disappearing completely, John contacted Grace and they spent the day together, before John told her at the end of their date that this would be the last time they would see each other, with John apparently becoming tearful. Following his date with Grace, John did just disappear. This was Monday, the 5th of August. After this, he appeared to drift around the country, going as far as Aberdeen on the north-east of Scotland, Liverpool on the north-west coast of England, Cardiff in Wales, and apparently also to the north of Ireland, trying to evade detection. While he was wandering around, he took it upon himself to write to a few newspapers, telling his side of the story, although this was accompanied by a lot of ramblings. He wrote to one newspaper saying that he planned to take his own life, blaming his problems on being rejected by his ex-girlfriend, who had transferred her affections onto another, before going on to say that he did go to the summit of Goatfell with Edwin, but that he had left him there in the company of 2 other men who said they were going back to Brodick. He said he then went down the mountain himself and met some friends, before visiting the hotel in Corrie, where he met several people who were camping, before leaving for his accommodation in Brodick about 10 p.m. He went on to say that he could easily prove this, but refused to bring his friends into this. In another letter to another newspaper, he apparently said that, "I smile when I read that my arrest is expected hourly." Newspaper articles were also by this time reporting not only John's description and photograph, but also what had happened to Edwin Rose, stating that it had been determined that the injuries to his skull were such as could not have been caused by a fall, that he had in fact been brutally hit repeatedly over the head by someone, and that it was likely this same person had lured him to a remote part of Goatfell in order to rob and murder him. Such was the strong feelings about Edwin's death, many would write into the newspapers, relaying their strong opinions, some saying it had likely been an accident and that John had panicked and hid Edwin's body, fearing he would be accused of murder, while others suggested that the fact John had taken the time to erect a dry wall with grass and heather suggested that this was a carefully planned and executed murder. Many who knew John were also interviewed, with their opinions about John appearing in newspaper articles too. John's former classmates gave a glowing description of his character, and said they found it hard to believe that John would kill anyone. He was the most unlikely person to do this. Although there were other more negative accounts of John's character, with some saying that he was fickle, although they too conceded that there was nothing mean in his nature. A previous landlady of his, the one who he had stolen jewellery from, she said that he had a massive ego and that she did not trust him. But his last landlady, the one at North Frederick Street, she said that he was of average temperament with regular habits. All agreed, though, that John was mainly friendly and chatty, certainly not uncommunicative like Francis Meikle had suggested. Could John have realised that Francis Meikle had taken a dislike to him and was deliberately not speaking to him, hadn't warmed to him, and that there was nothing more sinister than that? For 5 weeks, John wandered the country, evading capture, until Tuesday, the 3rd of September, 1889, when he was recognised at the train station of Fernigare in Hamilton, a 21-minute drive south-east of Glasgow. It had been the station master who had recognised the man, who had walked onto the station, but upon seeing a local policeman on the platform waiting for the train, he had about turned and left the station. This is what brought him to the attention of the station master, who then recognised the man as being the wanted John Lorry. The station master approached the police officer and told him this, and the police officer gave chase. With John realising that he was being followed by the police officer, he apparently discarded his coat and began to run across some fields towards a wood. Seeing this, the police officer blew his whistle, which attracted workers at the colliery, and so they too gave chase. The police officer instructed the colliery workers to surround the woods. However, a young boy who had just come from the wood area told the police officer that there was someone hiding in nearby bushes. The police officer and colliery workers approached the bushes and did in fact find John Lorry hiding there. The young boy who had told of the person hiding in the bushes also followed the group of men, and when the bushes were pushed aside, the young boy recalled seeing lots of blood on the man's collar and tie, as John had attempted to take his own life by slitting his throat with a razor, which required stitches. As John was removed from the bushes and cautioned, he said, "I robbed the man, but I did not murder him." Apparently, upon being caught, John was described in the Goatfell murder book as being composed, almost cheerful at being caught, and very talkative, apparently not having had many people to talk to for quite some time. Having received medical care, John Lorry was then taken to Rothsay on the Isle of Bute, as this was the main town within the jurisdiction of where Edwin Rose had been killed, where John was formally charged with the murder of Edwin Rose. Following being formally charged, John was put back on a steamboat headed for Greenock and Greenock Prison, where he would be kept until his trial. Now, while John Laurie had been on the run, a funeral had been held for Edwin Rose, and it was attended by Edwin's brother Benjamin. Sadly, Edwin's mother was of very poor health, and it appears that Edwin's death was actually kept from her. Edwin was actually buried in the village of Sannox on the Isle of Arran, despite being from South London. Over the years, Edwin's grave was visited by many locals and visitors to the island, who left wreaths and flowers, as well as many also visiting and paying their respects at the boulder where Edwin's body was found under. Now here's a strange bit of folklore for you about Arran that came out at the trial. In a bid to try and determine how Edwin had died, the shoes he would have been wearing at the time were sought, as the nails in the boots could have been checked to determine their condition, which may have shown whether Edwin had accidentally slipped or not. However, his shoes were missing. Like I said, this didn't come out until the trial, but apparently when a police officer who had been present when Edwin was found was asked where exactly Edwin's shoes were, he eventually said that they had been buried on the beach below the low water mark. Apparently, it's folklore that if a person who is murdered on Arran doesn't have their shoes buried at the low water mark, their ghost will walk the hills of Arran forever. Anyway, so Edwin had been buried on the 5th of August on the Isle of Arran. But on the 27th of September, his body was exhumed, as apparently an examination of Edwin's chest and abdominal cavities had not been carried out at the original examination. This examination was carried out by police surgeon Henry Littlejohn and Dr. William Fullerton, who had carried out the first examination with Dr. Andrew Gilmore. Nothing was found in the chest cavity, and his liver and other abdominal organs were in reasonable condition. And the two men concurred that Edwin's death had been caused by him being repeatedly hit with a heavy, blunt instrument on the left side of his head. Dr. Littlejohn concluded by saying that a fall was unlikely to have happened, as Edwin's jaw would not have been detached by this. This could only have occurred by being repeatedly hit. Before the trial began in November 1889, many people attempted to recreate the route from the summit of Goatfell Mountain that Edwin and John would have taken. Firstly, to see if it were at all possible that John could have murdered Edwin, dragged his body about 200 metres or 656 feet to the boulder, put him under it, built a dry wall of 42 stones, then made his way down the mountain, arriving at the Corrie Hotel just before 10 p.m. Local police officers and doctors attempted it, and it took them 2 hours and 15 minutes, although they were very aware of the terrain and what routes best to take. Members of John's family and engineers also attempted it, and it took them 2 hours and 55 minutes. Although everybody conceded that they had not allowed much time for the killing of Edwin, of dragging his body at least 200 metres or 656 feet to the boulder, and of building a wall. John and Edwin were last seen at 6:15 p.m. at the summit of Goatfell, and John was seen again just before 10 p.m. at the Corrie Hotel, quite calm and not dishevelled. That's about 3 hours and 45 minutes, so it is possible. Secondly, the actual route that John and Edwin had taken was contentious because it was unknown if the route taken by Edwin and John was deliberate to get Edwin to a location where John knew there would be few people around, or whether the route they took was the result of taking a wrong turn. Let me describe the route that the two men took to descend the summit of Goatfell Mountain. Rather than going back down the way they came, which was a much safer path and one they would have been familiar with, having taken that route up the mountain, Edwin and John decided to take a more adventurous route, which began with them having to navigate a narrow, windswept ridge. They then had the choice to take a path that led to Corrie via Corrie, or they could descend to the Saddle, which according to the Goatfell Murder Book is 1,456 feet or 444 metres high and is situated between Glen Rosa and Glen Sannox, two great glens. From the Saddle, you could then take a path via Glen Rosa, which would take you to Brodick, or take a path via Glen Sannox, which would take you to Corrie. And it is believed this was the path that John and Edwin intended to take. This decision was questioned, however, because the path that led to Corrie via Cluarantonn was much simpler and quicker than the route they decided to take, bearing in mind it would have been early evening and beginning to get dark. According to the Goatfell murder book, it is possible they decided to take this route via Glen Sannox because they wanted to complete the 3 great tourist attractions on the Isle of Arran, which are climbing Goatfell Mountain, seeing Glen Rosa, which they had gone through on the way up Goatfell Mountain, and then completing the trio by going through Glen Sannox. However, as it turned out, John and Edwin didn't actually take this route, but instead descended to Glen Sannox via Cluarantonn, which was a useful shortcut, but was a difficult and hazardous descent as Arran granite slabs had a tendency to erode into small stones, almost like gravel, with drops of 19 foot and 32 foot, or 5.7 metres and 9.7 metres, and this was where Edwin's body was found. While many believe that the route taken was a deliberate decision by John in order to get Edwin alone and in a perilous position where he could kill him, others believe that it had merely been a navigational error, possibly further impacted by the poor weather. The trial began in the High Court in Edinburgh on Friday, the 8th of November, where John Laurie faced the charge of assaulting Edwin Rose, throwing him down, beating him, and murdering him, to which John pleaded not guilty. The defence's stance was, as was instructed by John Laurie, that himself and Edwin had descended Goatfell Mountain independently, possibly taking different routes, and the last time John had seen Edwin was at 6:15 p.m. at the summit of Goatfell. All witnesses from Arran took to the stand and were questioned, which included David the shepherd, who repeated that he had seen John come down from Goatfell Mountain alone via a particularly difficult and unused route near a graveyard, about 9 or 9:30 p.m, when he had been in the company of 2 women. However, when the 2 women he had been with took to the stand, they said this hadn't been the case and that they hadn't seen John that night at all, and that David hadn't mentioned seeing this man to them. So, could John have been with friends before being seen at the Corrie Hotel, like he said when he had written to the newspapers, and not being alone, having just come down from Goatfell Mountain? But if this had been the case, then no witnesses had been called to back this up. Next, the 3 prosecution medical witnesses, Andrew Gilmore, William Fullerton and Henry Littlejohn, were questioned extensively, with the prosecution's aim being to try and firstly prove that Edwin had been murdered and that John had been the one to do this, and that secondly, Edwin had been murdered by being repeatedly hit by a stone to the left side of his head before being hit repeatedly in the face to try and hide his identity, and thirdly, that John had then robbed Edwin. The defence's aim was to try and prove that Edwin had died following a fall, a tragic accident. The 3 prosecution medical witnesses all agreed that Edwin's death had been as a result of direct violence by repeated blows to the head. If Edwin had indeed fallen instead, then there would have been broken limbs and or internal organ damage, which the second post-mortem confirmed was not the case. Just as an aside, the prosecution medical witness Andrew Gilmore, he was actually the father of the young medical student, also called Andrew Gilmore, that John Laurie, Edwin Rose, Francis Meikle and William Thom had had tea with 2 days before Edwin and John climbed Goatfell Mountain. Now, wouldn't this have been a conflict of interest, as his son had met both John and Edwin Edwin had been friendly with Francis and William, who both had warned Edwin against climbing up Goatfell Mountain with John, as they didn't trust him. They are all bound to have talked about the case, and Andrew Gilmore Sr. likely had already been told all about what the others thought of John Laurie before he took to the stand. The fact that Andrew Gilmore Sr. was Andrew Gilmore Jr.'s father was not disclosed at the time of the trial, and therefore his testimony was taken at face value. At the conclusion of day 1, where John Laurie was on trial for murdering Edwin Rose, quite a serious offence and could mean being executed if found guilty, as the death penalty wasn't abolished in the UK until 1965, the judge presiding over the trial told the court that the trial must conclude by the end of the following day. That would be only 2 days to try and prove or disprove a theory, despite a murder trial normally lasting 2 weeks. On the second day of the trial, John himself took to the stand, and he still was sticking with his story that he had left Edwin at the top of Goatfell Mountain with 2 other men. It was speculated that if John had actually listened to his defence team and said that Edwin had died following a fall and that yes, he had robbed him afterwards, then this would have made the prosecution's job much more harder to prove any foul play. However, John refused to change his story to help himself, and things just weren't adding up. If he had left Edwin alive at the top of Goatfell Mountain, then why had he removed Edwin's travel bag from the accommodation in Brodick? One might feel that he did this because he knew Edwin would not be coming back for it, although it was well highlighted that John would regularly not pay his bills and had stolen jewellery in the past, so perhaps it could be argued that this was just John's usual habit, to take what didn't belong to him. But then there was wearing Edwin's clothing. If he knew he was likely to come into contact with him again, would he really have been so brazen as to have worn Edwin's striped suit and yachting cap? Or was it more likely that he knew he wouldn't be seeing Edwin again? John did himself no favours by taking to the stand and sticking to this very shaky story. It also must be noted that at no point was there any mention of the option of an insanity plea being considered. Also taking to the stand on day 2 was Francis Meikle, and apparently his testimony clearly demonstrated his dislike for John and his belief that he had murdered Edwin. James Aitken also took to the stand and recounted his time spent with John Laurie on the Isle of Bute. Those who had travelled the same route that John and Edwin would have taken also took to the stand, with it being determined that Edwin and John could easily have avoided any difficult parts of the route by going a different way, and therefore it was believed Edwin had not accidentally fallen. Witness after witness for the prosecution took to the stand on the second day until about 2 p.m, when it was finally the defence's turn to present their case, and they were given a mere 3 hours to do this. The defence stated that it had been Edwin who had approached John on the steamboat, so clearly there was no planning in advance. They stated that while John had indeed stolen Edwin's Gladstone bag and clothing, this did not demonstrate that he had murdered Edwin. Indeed, they believed this proved that John had not known that Edwin was dead, as why on earth would he return to the Isle of Bute and spend the rest of his holiday wearing a man he knew was dead's clothing? The defence stated that John had carried on with his holiday as normal, with no one reporting any change in his behaviour, and that when he had returned back home and to work, his change in behaviour was only observed once reports of Edwin's disappearance began to emerge. The defence stated that the prosecution had failed to even prove that Edwin had been murdered, that the evidence was circumstantial, there were no witnesses, there was no murder weapon found, no blood had been observed on John's clothing at the Corrie Hotel that evening, he could not even be placed at the crime scene. All that could be proven was that he had stolen Edwin's Gladstone bag and striped suit. The prosecution had failed to prove that John had actually descended Goatfell Mountain with Edwin, and not that he had left him at the summit of Goatfell. It was also stated by the defence that if John had indeed murdered Edwin and then hid his body in a bid to conceal foul play, then why would he have left Edwin's belongings scattered about the area? Surely he would have gathered them up and hid them too. They believed that the scattering of the items, such as a pencil, a knife and a button, indicated that these items had fallen from Edwin's pockets as he fell down the mountain. The 3 defence medical experts, Dr. Watson, Dr. McGilvery and Dr. Thompson, had not been able to examine Edwin's body, but had been able to visit the crime scene, and had actually located 2 areas they believed the fall may have occurred. The defence's medical experts stated that the injuries Edwin had sustained were not consistent with him being repeatedly hit, but instead more likely to have occurred due to a fall. One thing of note was the fact that there were no injuries to Edwin's hands, with the prosecution saying that if it had been a fall, then surely Edwin would have reached out and grabbed something or to protect himself, and the lack of any injury to his hands indicated that no fall had happened. However, the defence medical experts countered by saying that if Edwin had fallen off the mountain backwards, then there would have been no chance for him to have grabbed anything. It was also asserted by the defence that if John Lorry had in fact inflicted such violence on Edwin Rose, then he most definitely would have been covered in his blood. However, this had not been noted by the man who had bought John a drink at the Corrie Hotel. So, over the 2-day trial, there were 53 prosecution witnesses called out of the 86 that had attended the court, and 7 defence witnesses called out of the 13 that had attended the court. But most of the time, it was the 3 medical witnesses for the prosecution and the 3 medical witnesses for the defence that were on the stand being questioned to try and establish whether Edwin's injuries were consistent with falling backwards over a ledge and his death being an accident, or if his injuries were consistent with receiving a series of violent blows. However, with everyone being well aware that the judge wanted the trial completed by the end of Saturday, the defence and prosecution summed up, both putting forward good arguments for and against a fall, with the defence ending with the fact that the prosecution had failed to prove that a murder had actually been committed, and certainly not that it had been John who had committed it. The judge then summed up before at 9:45 p.m. the 15 male members of the jury left to deliberate. But being aware of the judge's instruction that the trial was to conclude that day, it only took them 45 minutes to return a verdict. It was reported that while the jury were deliberating, John Lorry apparently was very confident of either receiving a not guilty or a not proven verdict. But he was sure that it would not be a guilty verdict, as there just wasn't strong enough evidence to convict him. At 10:30 p.m. on Saturday the 9th of November 1889, the jury delivered their verdict, and John Watson Lorry was found guilty of the murder of Edwin Robert Rose. There was a deathly silence inside the court, as nobody could quite believe that the well-dressed, well-groomed, well-behaved young man in front of them had just been found guilty of murder. John apparently went very pale and stood absolutely emotionless, shocked. The verdict was very close, as 8 jurors had gone for the guilty verdict, while 7 jurors had been unsure and had gone for the not proven verdict. However, with the guilty verdict having been delivered, the trial judge then donned the customary black cap, and with a slight break in his voice, he sentenced John Lorry to be hanged by the neck between the hours of 8 and 10 a.m. on the 30th of November 1889. John Lorry then turned to the courtroom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am innocent of this charge." When word of John's guilty verdict reached those who were waiting outside of the courthouse, it was met with some cheers, a few boos, but mainly surprise. Nobody had expected a guilty verdict, feeling that the evidence given was entirely circumstantial and a conviction should have been impossible. Nevertheless, John Lorry was taken to Greenock Prison to await his execution. He was monitored around the clock, everything he said and did was recorded, and the wardens tried to keep him entertained by playing chess, cards, or dominoes with him. Once John got over the initial shock of his guilty verdict, he spent the days and weeks until his execution date flitting between calm and composed to breaking down, saying that he felt detached and like it was happening to someone else. However, due to the fact he had been convicted by a majority of 8-7, John hung on to the hope that this would mean his execution wouldn't go ahead. How could it when there had only been one vote in it? No, he was confident he wouldn't be executed. Even so, protests and petitions were started, not only against the death sentence, but indeed against the verdict of guilty, with many believing that John Lorry was an innocent man, and fierce debates and medical evidence was presented in newspapers. While John had so much support and petitions had begun in his favour, sadly John's own family did not support him, believing that he actually was guilty of Edwin's murder, going so far as to ask a reverend to visit John and tell him, on behalf of his family, that they thought he was guilty and that he should make a full confession. Saddened by this, John told the Reverend that he would not be making a full confession. He was innocent. What John did instead was to make a full statement in the presence of the prison governor and his law agent, in which he said that he and Edwin had climbed Goatfell Mountain. Then the pair did begin to descend to the ridge overlooking Glen Sannox. He said that Edwin was quite a distance ahead of him when he saw Edwin slip and fall, falling head first and landing on his head. John said when he reached Edwin he was barely alive and was moaning in pain. He then closed his eyes and died in front of him. John said he then ripped off part of Edwin's waterproof coat and threw it away, as well as his walking stick, before dragging Edwin's body down the mountain. He said that Edwin's knife, button and pencil must have fallen out of Edwin's pockets as he dragged him. John stated that he believed Edwin had sustained the extensive facial and head injuries from being dragged down the mountain over large rocks and slabs. He said that he did then go through Edwin's pockets and took his chain and watch, some silver, letters and paper, but then threw the chain and watch away near where Edwin's body had landed. He said he then placed Edwin's body under the boulder and concealed it by piling up stones around the entrance, before descending the rest of the way down the mountain, and arriving at the Corrie Hotel just before 10 p.m, where he had a drink with a man who was camping nearby. He said in this statement that he had decided to hide Edwin's body instead of raising the alarm, as he was scared he would be blamed for his death. He concluded by saying that he did not lift a hand or a stone to Edwin, nor did he push him. So he was finally telling the story that his defence team had tried to get him to do at his trial. The change in his story now, though, didn't look good. Despite this statement, John's family still were convinced he had murdered Edwin, and on the 19th of November, his brother Gavin and his Aunt Bella visited him and asked him again to make a full confession. But no, John stated that he would not do this, as he did not kill Edwin, and instead he wrote a statement to the Scottish Secretary in the hope that this would secure him a reprieve. Now, you can find this full statement and his previous one in the Goatfell murder book, but this statement to the Scottish Secretary basically just repeated what his previous statement had, detailing what had happened on Goatfell, how it had been an accident, and apologising for not telling the truth at his trial. But as he had stated in the newspapers before his arrest that he had left Edwin at the top of Goatfell with 2 men, he felt his best defence was to continue with this untruthful story, and he asked for a reprieve. The Scottish Secretary wrote back denying a reprieve. But that was okay. There was still a petition to be sent to the Scottish Secretary, and on the 22nd of November, 8 days before the execution date, the petition had been signed by 138,140 people who believed that the evidence presented at John's trial had not conclusively established his guilt, and this too was sent to the Scottish Secretary. However, despite this petition being sent to the Scottish Secretary, John's own plea to the Scottish Secretary for a reprieve, and despite the intense and widespread attention and debate about whether John was guilty or not, and if he should be hanged or not, no reprieve was forthcoming. However, 2 days before the execution date, finally, John received a reprieve letter of sorts, which stated that his death penalty had been reduced instead to him being kept in penal servitude for the term of his natural life, and that he was to be moved to Perth prison, although he was still not out of the woods, as this reduction was apparently only temporary while a review of whether he was of sound mind was carried out. This was on the back of a rushed insanity petition that had been put forward to the Scottish Secretary. Upon completion of the review, which determined that John was of unsound mind, his life imprisonment sentence became permanent. While many were happy with this outcome, as executions were becoming very controversial, some, including Edwin's family, questioned this reprieve being given on the grounds of John having an unsound mind, when in fact no mention of this had been made at the trial, with many wanting to know what was in the review that pointed to John being of unsound mind. This review was not forthcoming for a long time, and so many were left with this question unanswered, which was probably just as well, as when the review was made available, it stated that John had been deemed to be of unsound mind because it was discovered that he masturbated, and that this was said to cause insanity. John spent a probationary period in Perth prison where he was continually assessed, eventually being deemed to be sane, and was then moved on the 16th of September 1890 to the newly opened Peterhead prison, located 30 miles north of Aberdeen, and which would go on to gain a reputation for being Scotland's toughest and most infamous jail, where prisoners were made to carry out productive hard labour and were to remain silent at all times and not speak to other prisoners, or they would be severely punished by having their food rationed, being made to work harder, and so much more. Due to the location of the prison being about a 350-mile or 563-kilometre round trip from his family, they were unable or unwilling to visit him throughout his sentence here. John continued to maintain his innocence of killing Edwin, only admitting to robbing and concealing his body, and would frequently send appeal letters to the Scottish Secretary, starting in 1892 after serving just 2 years, as John felt he had served enough time at this point and believed he should be released. This was rejected, and so John sent another appeal letter 1 year later where he begged to be released, saying if his sentence was to continue for much longer, then he didn't want to be alive. However, this appeal was also rejected. Following this rejection, John's reasonably good behaviour ceased, and therefore his punishments were increased, with a fellow prisoner stating that his demeanour at this time changed, and he didn't seem to care anymore what happened to him. His perceived bad behaviour included speaking to other inmates, being rude, and refusing to work or adhere to orders, although by 1897 his behaviour had started to improve again. And by the time 1899 came around, John, having spent quite some time in the prison infirmary due to a bad bout of appendicitis, had been taken off productive hard labour and put on to more lighter indoor tasks, and so his behaviour improved even more, with a medical report around this time describing his medical and physical health to be good. In 1901, with John having now completed his 12th year in prison and approaching his 40th birthday, he truly believed that one of his many continued appeals would be looked on more favourably, especially as John's most recent appeal had stated that he was practically an invalid due to his bout of appendicitis, rheumatism in his shoulder, and his bowel problems, and that he should be released on grounds of ill health. However, this appeal was rejected, and on the day of John's 40th birthday, he was taken to the prison hospital as his mental health deteriorated rapidly and significantly. He had become extremely anxious, with paranoid and rambling thoughts, although despite this he still continued his frequent appeal letters to the Scottish Secretary, although he began to take a different approach, possibly feeling that nothing else had worked. And so he decided the best course of action was to confess, and so he wrote to the Scottish Secretary saying that he had indeed pushed Edwin down the mountain, had thrown stones at his head, and had hid his body, stating, according to the Goatfell murder book, that this act had been the work of a distracted fool. Despite this different approach, John's appeals are yet again turned down, with him feeling that his failure to be released or to be sent to a less tough prison was just out of spite. Following the confessional letters to the Scottish Secretary, and with these not securing a release for him either, he then says that it was due to his food being poisoned that made him write these confessional letters. Despite this odd behaviour, a medical report at the time actually said that there had been an overall improvement in his mental state and behaviour. After having served 12 years, John started to note in his continued appeal letters that others who had committed far worse crimes than himself were being released far earlier than him. It was at this point that the Scottish Secretary requested another medical assessment of John, and this medical assessment stated, according to the Goatfell murder book, that John did not show any sorrow or loss for his crimes, and that he was not depressed, and that John was well behaved and quiet, and that his heart, lungs and kidneys were healthy. However, it also stated that John was fond of talking about indecent sexual matters without any shame, and indicated that there was little doubt that John was mentally defective, going on to say that his mental defects had increased throughout his imprisonment, and should his imprisonment continue, this will increase further. However, despite this, John's appeal was yet again turned down. As John mentioned in one of his appeal letters, it would appear that others who had committed far worse crimes than John were serving a lot less time than him. While John assumed that it was just out of spite that he was being kept imprisoned so much longer than others, the actual reason, which is mentioned in the Goatfell murder book, is that nobody really knew what to do with John. As John had been certified insane after his trial and had had his death sentence reduced instead to being kept in penal servitude for the term of his natural life, but then following being assessed throughout his time in prison, being certified as actually being sane, it was not known whether it was safe to release John on licence or whether John should actually be sent to what was the lunatic department in Perth, as he was meant to serve a term of his natural life, and these discussions were had in the background continually. That was until 1902, when John had served 13 years and had yet again sent another appeal letter to the Scottish Secretary, who in turn ordered another medical examination. This examination concluded that John was insane and that he was a suitable candidate to be transferred to the lunatic department in Perth. Great, finally it's known what to do with John. However, before his transfer could take place, it was determined that while John was insane and would likely become more so if he stayed in Peterhead prison, that was exactly what was going to happen. He was to stay in Peterhead prison, and again his appeal was turned down. However, John was told that this would be reviewed again after he had served 15 years in Peterhead prison. However, it wasn't until September 1909, 20 years after John was captured in Hamilton, that discussions took place again to decide what to do with John. Release him on licence, transfer him to the lunatic department at Perth, or keep him at Peterhead prison. It wouldn't be until the 24th of August 1910 that John would finally have a decision. He was to be moved to the lunatic department in Perth, which he was, and where he was officially certified as suffering from progressive dementia. However, John was not happy with this outcome. He believed he should have been allowed his freedom. He'd served his time more than most, and he didn't want to be or think he should be in the lunatic department, despite the fact that he'd been sentenced to spend his natural lifetime in prison, and that he could sit in the garden when he wanted, could talk freely, could go on trips out, listen to music, and play the violin that his brother Gavin had brought for him, as he had enjoyed playing the violin as a young man, just like Edwin Rose had. Despite John not being happy with the situation of being kept incarcerated, even though it was not now in the tough, hard labour of Peterhead prison, but the gentler environment of the lunatic department, with the end of the First World War in 1918, having now spent 29 years locked up, John began to finally accept that he would remain locked up for the remainder of his life. However, to look at John after his 29 years locked up, you would certainly not see the hardship that he had had to endure, with him looking young for his age, with a good complexion, a healthy body and mind. It would appear he walked upright and was exceptionally proud of his appearance and took care of himself. In January 1925, when John had spent 36 years locked up, a newspaper started a campaign for John's release. However, again, this proved fruitless, and in April 1926, John suffered a stroke and lost the use of his left arm and leg. In March 1930, 4 years later, John suffered another stroke, and this time his right side was paralysed, and he was practically confined to bed and was unable to feed himself. John died 7 months later, on the 4th of October 1930, at the age of 69, having spent 41 years locked up, which was the longest anyone in Scotland had been incarcerated for at that time. So what do you think? Do you think John had murdered Edwin, or did Edwin fall? Do you think John Laurie deserved to spend the remainder of his life locked up, even if he did kill Edwin Rose? Do you think John was insane? Because it appears the medical experts over the years weren't able to determine this one way or the other. What do you think? Don't forget to let me know on either social media or email me at contact@scottishmurders.com, and your opinions will form a great debate episode in the new year. Have a great Christmas and New Year, and we'll see you in 2023.
Scottish Murders is a production of Cluarantonn.